In this section, we are going to discuss what sex addiction actually is. And yes, it actually is a real thing. And there's criteria used to diagnose or self-diagnose if a person is indeed dealing with sex addiction. First and foremost, I want to say it doesn't really have to do with the specific behavior. Most of the questions I get in and a lot of the concern that I hear from folks is on the particular sexual behaviors that they're engaging in. That's not what sex addiction is. We'll talk more about that in the next section. We live in a time and in a culture that is real weird about sex and sexuality and has pushed pretty much all of it into the shadows, which creates shame and creates a lot of confusion on what healthy sexuality actually is. So we're not gonna be talking about that in this course, but just know that if you're engaged in behaviors that perhaps in society are known as strange or are on the margins or are kink or even are on the darker side, that doesn't necessarily mean that you are dealing with sex addiction. I'm going to talk about the criteria that's used to help diagnose or self-diagnose if someone is dealing with sex addiction. You might not relate to all of it. You might relate to a few of them, or it might all hit home. That's okay. This is a judgment-free space. We're just learning. These things exist, and they might exist for you. They do not define who you are. They do not tell you where you are going. They just are behaviors that some of us have found ourselves engaging in. Are they okay? No, not necessarily. Not if it's outside of your value system or outside of agreements you've made. But for this section, we're just going to share about them as they are. No judgment, no shame. Just see if anything lands with you. I look at sex addiction as unwanted sexual behavior, which can also include thoughts and fantasy, that is outside of one's control. So that's a pretty general definition, but there's a really big spectrum of sexual behavior. So it's not tied to any one specific thing. We're just going to call it unwanted sexual behavior that's outside of one's control. That out of control element is key when we're talking about addiction. If you have moved into a space where you're engaging in this area compulsively, where you're not able to stop, you might be dealing with addiction. If you have tried to stop and you have not been able to, that's a criteria for looking at addiction. If you know that there are negative consequences that are potentially going to be a result of your behavior or actions, but you engage in them anyway, that can be addiction. If you lose out on opportunities, relationships, time, money, health, as a way of prioritizing sexual behavior, that can be addiction. If you've noticed a progression or an escalation in your thoughts or behavior, that also is part of addiction. That is common in every area of addiction, where what once worked no longer is enough to alter that mental and emotional state. And so we progress and move up, we escalate into different behaviors. An example of that might be watching a really gentle form of pornography when we began, and moving into other areas that maybe are outside of your value system, maybe are outside of the law, but that initial stuff doesn't work to create the same feeling anymore. That's a progression. That's actually going on in the brain. It's not because you're a shitty person. That's just what's happening in the brain. That is common in every area of addiction. If you're preoccupied with thoughts or planning or engaging in this behavior where you're missing out on life, that can also indeed be a sign of addiction. The biggest thing to look for is, do I want to be doing this? Can I actually stop? Are there consequences if I don't and I'm choosing to do it anyway? If you prioritize sexual behavior above everything else in your life consistently over time, then stick with us. That's probably a pretty good indicator that you are indeed dealing with sex addiction. Please note, I am not saying you are a sex addict, and I'm not going to. That's not who you are. That's not what you are. If you relate to any of these things we just shared about, that is an experience that you are having. It is something you are engaging in. It is not who you are. It might not feel that way because for a lot of us, this has been going on for as long as we can remember. It's been progressing from an early age onward, and it really seems to be who we are because it shows up in everything we do. Maybe you're like me and you're the person making inappropriate sexual comments or jokes at the office or at a funeral or in places where it doesn't make sense. And you're just that girl or you're that guy. Well, you're probably not. Keep an open mind, and if you're able, keep an open heart. I know that this stuff feels really personal. You might have caused harm with some of these behaviors, and it feels like that's part of your identity, but it's not. I don't care what anyone tells you, and I don't have to meet you. This is not who you are. This does not define the life you're going to lead. Maybe you related with all of that. I did. Or maybe just some of it. That's all right. We're going to talk in the next section about what sex addiction isn't, because there's a lot of misinformation and misunderstandings about this area of addiction. So we'll talk on that in the next section. If you are engaged in non-consensual or illegal activity in this area, that's also probably an indicator that there's something going on that is addiction based, because all of those things tie to that other criteria we talked about earlier. This all might be really hard to hear if it's progressed to that space for you, and that might feel very outside of your integrity to be engaging in those behaviors that are outside of your values, that are outside of the values we've agreed on as a society. It's not great. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It's not great, but it's not hopeless either. There is healing for that as well, and there is acceptance, at least here. So please keep watching and take what is helpful and just leave the rest. I'll see you in the next section.